Guten Abend, good evening. I am very pleased not only that you have withstood the temptations of June to come here and listen to an excellent and very exciting speaker whom we've been able to invite, Kenan Malik, author of a new book just out, The Quest for a Moral Compass, which will be part of the subject of his talk tonight. And let me just introduce Mr. Malik a little bit to you. He was born in India and grew up in Manchester, I believe, and is by trade, as it were, actually a neurobiologist and historian of science who has gravitated magically towards philosophy. He has
many years since I've done neurobiology. It was a different life.
It's many years since you've done anything proper, yes. Yeah. I can understand that. Mr. Malik has taught and given seminars at many universities, from Oxford and Cambridge to Oslo and Melbourne and Florence. He regularly appears on BBC radio and television, moderates shows there. He writes for many newspapers, English-speaking newspapers such as The Guardian and the Financial Times. And he's also very active in digital publishing, in digital publications. And he does have a very well-designed website with a blog, with book reviews, with essays about various subjects, which I can only warmly recommend to you. It is very well designed, and I always find something very interesting to read in there. Tonight, however, Kenan Malik is going to speak about a subject that seems slightly counterintuitive at first look, because the Enlightenment and the death of God are really two things that don't often turn up in the same sentence. One is classically 17th and 18th century, one is 19th century, namely Nietzsche. But here is the man himself to explain about this. Kenan Malik, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. It's a pleasure and an honour to be here, and my thanks to you and to the Kreisky Foundation for inviting me here. And Philip's right, the idea of the Enlightenment and the death of God seems at first glance quite strange. I mean, no Enlightenment philosopher talked of the death of God. It is a 19th century phrase. It comes to us mainly through Nietzsche, who wrote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." In the 18th century, God was very much alive. The power of the church was deep and entrenched. Those who challenged it usually did so clandestinely and were themselves often believers. So why, to pick up Philip's question, talk about the Enlightenment and the death of God? Well, there are two aspects to what we call the death of God. The first is the decline in religious belief. The second is the growth of a new kind of faith. Faith in the capacity of humans to act without guidance from beyond. And what I want to suggest is that the decline of religious belief has been overstated, but faith in human capacities has been undervalued. We have become so obsessed with the idea of the decline of religious belief that we've almost ignored the significance of faith in human capacities and the decline of that faith in the post-Enlightenment world. And the importance of the Enlightenment, it seems to me, is that it was the hinge upon which views of what it is to be human transformed quite dramatically through in European culture. Today, the idea of the death of God is usually seen as a struggle between science and religion. That's the moral that most people take from the so-called God wars. And so most people expect the story of the death of God to be the story of a bloody struggle between science and religion, but that's not how it happened. That's not the case at all. Historically, the challenge to God came less from science than it did from politics. At the heart of the 18th century God wars, if it's not too anachronistic to call it that, was a debate not so much about theology or metaphysics, though there were, of course, fierce debates about those issues, but about the social order and human freedom. Or to put it another way, beneath the fierce debates about theology and metaphysics was a more fundamental debate about social order and human nature. One way to think about it is this, that for more than a millennium, Christianity had provided the crucible in which intellectual and social life was lived in Europe. Belief in God determined the way people lived, the way they were governed, the way they structured society. It told them what to hope for and what to fear. It legitimized communities and kingdoms and empires. It explained the present, the past, and the future. It explained the heavens and the origins of humans, their purpose, their destiny. And to unstitch this, seemed to many people, was to unstitch society itself. There's a very famous case of blasphemy in England in the late 17th century, where an Englishman called John Taylor was convicted of blasphemy for calling Jesus Christ a bastard and for saying that religion was a cheat. And he was tried in front of the most important judge in Britain, the Lord Chief Justice, Matthew Hale. And this is what Matthew Hale had to say about it when he convicted John Taylor of blasphemy. He said, "Such kind of wicked and blasphemous words are not only an offence against God and religion, but a crime against laws, states, and governments, and therefore punishable in this court. To say religion is a cheat is to dissolve all those obligations whereby civil societies are preserved, and Christianity being parcel of the laws of England, therefore to reproach the Christian religion is to speak in subversion of the law." And I think that's it's an important case, and it's an important point, because at the heart of what he's saying is that any challenge to Christian doctrine was also a challenge to the social order. And to preserve the social order, one must necessarily protect Christianity. And it's against this background that we need to understand the story of the death of God. Because what that story encapsulates is not merely a debate, as I said, about God or doctrine or faith, but a story about the social order, what constitutes the good society and how to construct it. It's also a story about what it means to be human. Different social structures, different moral orders are necessarily rooted in different conceptions of human nature. For our notions of what it is to be human, of what humans are, of what humans are capable of being, inevitably shapes our visions of what constitutes a good society. Or to put it another way, how we see God is a reflection of how we see human beings. Now, Christianity had a particular account of human nature that undergird both social structure and moral order of Western Europe. And at the heart of that account was a doctrine of original sin. It seems to me the doctrine of original sin was in many ways, and we don't think about it these days because it's so far from the way we think about religion, but it was central to the way people understood not just religion, not just Christianity, but their whole place in society. For right up to the 18th, 19th century. And it seems to me the doctrine of original sin is perhaps the most original contribution, the most profound contribution of Christianity to Western culture. and perhaps its most pernicious. The insistence that all humans are tainted by Adam and Eve's disobedience of God in eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, that it is impossible, as a consequence, for humans to do good on their own, because the fall has degraded both their moral capacity and their willpower, and that only through God's grace can humans achieve salvation. That central idea was central to the way society was constructed and to social relations in Europe for a millennium and a half. And it led to a very bleak view of human nature that came to dominate Western ethical thinking as Christianity became the crucible in which that thinking took place. Now, that bleakness of view had already been challenged before the Enlightenment from within the Christian tradition, from Dante to Erasmus, from Milton to Michelangelo. We can see the development of what we now call a humanist sensibility within Christianity itself. But not until the Enlightenment was there a full frontal assault on the Christian idea of human nature. There's a story that's often told about Immanuel Kant and a visit he received from his physician about a week before his death in 1804. Kant, on his deathbed, he rose to thank the doctor, and in disconnected words said to him, the feeling for humanity has not left me yet. And the physician, who was trying to calm him down and persuade him to sit down, it said, was moved almost to tears. Now, the story might seem charming but inconsequential, probably apocryphal. Yet Kant struggled, even on his deathbed, to give an expression to his humanity, revealed the degree to which this idea had become central to the consciousness of that age. The notion of humanity possessed in the 18th century a number of different meanings, some harking back to old definitions, some carving out new ones. From the late Middle Ages, humanity had been synonymous with gentleness, courtesy, and politeness. And as Kant's response to the physician reveals, this meaning was still important in the 18th century. Humanity was an expression not simply of civility, but also of civilization to those in the 18th century. And closely intertwined with these meanings was the idea of humanity as representing the qualities, especially the moral and ethical qualities, that pertains specifically to humans. Humanity, in this sense, was distinct from barbarity. The moral dimension of being human was of immense importance to Enlightenment philosophers. But perhaps most importantly, there developed in the 18th century a new meaning of humanity as that which is distinct from the divine. To be human meant to have the power and the capacity to be master of one's own destiny, independently of divine intervention. Whereas for previous generations, nature made sense as God's order and only as God's order. For many in the Enlightenment, only humans infused nature and the cosmos with meaning. If we banish man, the thinking and contemplating being, from the face of the earth, Denis Diderot claimed, this moving and sublime spectacle of nature will be nothing more than a sad and mute scene. It is the presence of man which makes the existence of beings meaningful. The importance of that idea can't be overstated, and how revolutionary, how transformative it was compared to the way that previous generations had seen the relationship between humanity and the world around them. Meaning, for Diderot, for the philosophers, was not something to be discovered. It is something that humans, and only humans, created. We're not talking here about the death of God, but it is a sentiment without which, it seems to me, the death of God cannot make sense, without which the death of God becomes meaningless. Because that's the second side of the point I was making, that the death of God is in part about the decline of religious belief. Something that never happened in the 18th century. That was a 19th century, 20th century phenomenon. But the other side of it is this exalted celebration, this faith in human capacities to be able to infuse meaning in the world. The exalted humanism of men like Diderot was a product of a new sense of optimism. Optimism itself was a word that came into the French language in the 18th century. And it was an attitude that rested partly on a new belief in progress. The historian Gilbert Murray described the decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Christian worldview as the rise of asceticism, of mysticism, of pessimism, a loss of self-confidence, of hope in this life, and of faith in normal human effort, despair and patient inquiry, a cry for infallible revelation. And this he christened a failure of nerve. Peter Gay, who's the historian of the Enlightenment, whose volumes on the Enlightenment from the 60s still are a wonderful read today. He vividly describes the experience of the 18th century not as the failure of nerve, but as the recovery of nerve. And that's, in a sense, what we're talking about. Now, it's, of course, impossible to discuss the Enlightenment, and particularly ideas of progress and of God, except in the shadow of someone, I think, who's going to be speaking in this series in the future, Jonathan Israel, and his recasting of the Enlightenment through a series of monumental books in which he challenges both the traditional accounts of the Enlightenment and more recent revisionist histories of the 18th century. Traditional accounts effectively took their cue from the philosophers themselves. To the question, what is enlightenment? Kant had responded that it was man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. For Kant, as for Voltaire, for Hume, for Diderot, the importance of the Enlightenment was that it cleansed the European mind of medieval superstition and allowed the light of reason to shine upon it. Now, this was, of course, a self-serving definition, and one that airily dismissed pre-Enlightenment intellectual traditions upon which many of the philosophers drew. But it was also one that gave a sense of the historical significance of the Enlightenment, something that subsequent historians, people like Ernst Cassirer and Peter Gay, developed and reworked. Now, this idea in these histories of a single coherent enlightenment understood in terms of an intellectual transformation of the European mind has come to be challenged over the past half century from a number of quarters. Some historians have started developing national rather than pan-European accounts. The French Enlightenment, the German Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, each analysed in its own terms and often as a display of national pride. Others, historians such as Robert Darnton, for instance, have stressed not the intellectual but the social and cultural aspects of the Enlightenment. And more recently, postmodern scholars have challenged the very idea of the Enlightenment as a good. And Enlightenment rationalism, of Enlightenment universalism, long seen as the foundation stones of progressive thoughts, are now often dismissed as Eurocentric, even racist. What's interesting about Israel's account is that he both takes the original view of the Enlightenment as the transformative period when Europe shifted from being a culture based largely on a shared core of faith, tradition and authority, to one in which everything, no matter how fundamental or deeply rooted, was questioned in the light of philosophical reason. And yet, despite language that harks back to Kant, Israel is also deeply critical of much of the Enlightenment and hostile to many of those figures. And at the heart of his argument is the insistence that there were two Enlightenments. The mainstream Enlightenment of Kant and Locke and Voltaire and Hume, the one of which most people know, the one that provides the public face of the Enlightenment. It's the one about which most historians have written. But, Israel argues, it was the radical Enlightenment, shaped by lesser-known figures such as D'Holbach and Diderot and Condorcet, and in particular Spinoza, that provided the Enlightenment's heart and soul. And the two Enlightenments divided on the question of whether reason reigned supreme in human affairs, as the radicals insisted, or whether reason had to be limited by faith and tradition, the view of the mainstream. Now, there are many criticisms one can make of this account. I did an interesting interview with Jonathan Israel a few months back where we debated some of our differences over it. The divergence between the radicals and the mainstream is not, I think, as sharp as he suggests. Hobbes, for instance, was an atheist and a materialist, but a political authoritarian. Rousseau and Kant were theists, but supportive of revolutionary thinking. Many revolutionists, such as Tom Paine, rejected institutionalized religion, but accepted a deistic idea of God. And such fuzziness, I suppose, is only to be expected, for ideas and beliefs never cleave cleanly, especially in an age as questioning as the Enlightenment. Nevertheless, however fuzzy the boundaries may be and however difficult it may be to pigeonhole a particular individual, the distinction between the radical and the mainstream remains, I think, both important and illuminating, and it provides a powerful, cogent framework through which to understand the intellectual and social conflict, both in the Enlightenment and in the post-Enlightenment world. The story of the death of God, I've already suggested, is really the story of a struggle over social order and of what it means to be human. And this was also at the heart of the struggle between the radical Enlightenment and the moderate Enlightenment. And the story I'll be telling really takes that as the framework. That distinction between the radicals and the mainstream expresses also, in part, a new relationship between morality and politics that was developing in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the pre-modern world, morality grew out of the structure of the community, a structure that was given. Societies changed, of course, but nobody believed that one could will social change. Morality was about how to define right and wrong behaviours within a given structure of society. Every individual possessed a fixed place in society from which to derive his duties, rights and obligations, and moral rules both derived from and defined his role within that community, his duties towards other members, and the actions that were compatible with his roles and his duties. And the structure of the community, the role of the individual, the rules of morality were all bound together by divine law. All were vested in the authority of God. The emergence of the modern world, from about the 16th century onward, transformed all that. And one of the big changes it brought about was that the idea of social structures as a given. Social structures were no longer seen as given, but became debated politically, challenged physically, so that liberals and socialists, conservatives and communists, monarchists and republicans, all contested the idea of what constitutes a good society. Again, we're so used to it that we imagine that that's the way the societies have always been. But that's actually a very modern phenomenon, that kind of contestation of social structure. And as people rejected the idea of society as a given, so ought what ought to be, became a political as much as a moral demand. How society ought to be was defined by the political possibilities of social change. Moral transformation rested both on the possibilities and the necessity of social transformation in a way that had previously seemed unimaginable. Now, all the 18th century philosophers recognized that to create a moral society, one had to create a more rational society. But only those who followed in the footsteps of the radicals, the radical Enlightenment, accepted that to create a rational society would require the root and branch transformation of society. And it is in this context, I think, we need to understand both the debate between the radicals and the mainstream and the debate about God. And to understand that, to understand the point I'm making, let's consider two of the key philosophers of the mainstream Enlightenment, John Locke and David Hume. Now, Locke is generally regarded as providing the philosophical foundations of modern liberalism. And his letter concerning toleration, particularly important, a key text in the development of modern liberal ideas about freedom of expression and worship. And it is indeed a powerful defence of the idea of religious tolerance. It's also a very restricted defence. And it's interesting to see why. Locke's starting point in the letter is his insistence that the duty for every individual is to seek his own salvation. The means to do so are his religious beliefs and the ability openly to worship. The power of human political control cannot therefore extend rightfully over either sphere, either his religious beliefs or his ability to worship. And the proper concern of civil government, which is life, the protection of life, liberty, health and property, cannot be used to constrain or shape either people's ability to worship or their beliefs in relation to their salvation. But while that's in many ways it was a very brave argument to make at a time when the whole of Europe was set by tempestuous religious strife, and intolerance and persecution were the norm, it's also a very exceedingly narrow notion of liberty. This is what Locke says. He says, no opinions contrary to human society or to those moral rules which are necessary for the preservation of civil society are to be tolerated by the magistrates. And this led him at best to equivocate about Catholics, at worst to be openly intolerant. Catholics, he argued, owed their primary allegiance not to London or Paris or wherever, but to Rome, and so could not expect toleration or protection. It's a few to claim that few make about Catholics today, but many about Jews or Muslims. That same argument still runs. Further, Locke argued, those who deny the being of God are not at all to be tolerated, because atheism undermines all morality and therefore was a threat to the very foundations of society. The taking away of God, though even but in thought, Locke wrote, dissolves all, because promises, covenants and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. In other words, religion is central, is important to Locke, because it's central to maintaining the social order. The echo here of Chief Justice Matthews Hale and his point about blasphemy is really strong. The idea, the reason for defending Christianity, the reason for defending God, is not about God or about religion. It is about the social order and the necessity to defend the social order. And what's interesting is the striking contrast between that view and that of the tolerance, the idea of tolerance of Locke's near contemporary, Spinoza. For Spinoza, freedom of worship, far from constituting the core of toleration, is a peripheral issue. His starting point is not the salvation of the soul, but the promotion of individual liberty. The less freedom of judgment is granted to men, he argued, the further they are removed from the most natural state, and consequently, the more repressive the regime. And his real fear was not that dissenting views might undermine the power of faith and therefore undermine society, but that ecclesiastic power might undermine individual liberty, and hence he advocated the use of the state to limit the size and power, for instance, of religious congregations. Now, to our age, in which state and church are separated in most liberal democracies, and in which the power of the church has diminished, while that of the state has grown, this might seem an illiberal attitude. And as illiberal, say, as Locke's refusal to tolerate Catholics or atheists. Yet in an age in which church and state were often fused and ecclesiastic power was immense and often an obstacle to individual liberty, Spinoza's arguments are truly radical. Now, it's easy to regard the differences between Locke and Spinoza as those between a believer and an atheist, as between someone whose notion of tolerance is limited by his faith and someone for whom there are no such restraints. And to a certain extent, that is true. But the cleft between them ran much deeper. It was a debate also about social order, about what constitutes the good society, about what it is to be human, and what human freedom means. And that's an issue that I think I'll come back to again and again, because it's an issue that's at the heart of this discussion about what is why we need God, the 18th century debate of why we need God. Take David Hume. If Locke is seen as the founding father of liberalism, Hume is seen as the preeminent skeptic. And at almost any philosophical issue he touched upon, he took a skeptical view. In epistemology, for instance, he dismissed standard accounts of causality and argued that our conceptions of cause and effect are grounded in habits of thinking rather than being perceptions of causal forces in the external world itself. He questioned common notions of personal identity and argued that there's no permanent self that continues over time. He insisted that reason is inherently contradictory and limited, and that only through naturally instilled beliefs can we navigate our way through common life. And he was, of course, famously sceptical about religion. James Boswell, Samuel Johnson's biographer, he visited Hume on his deathbed. He reported later that Hume had said to him, he said to me, he was no more, because he wanted to find out whether he had recanted, that whether he believed in God. And Hume, Boswell reported, said to me he was no more uneasy to think he should not be there after his life than he had been not been there before he began to exist, which is a typical Hume formulation. And Hume's withering criticisms of standard theistic defences of God against miracles and so on, his moral theory, which is rejected the need for God for morality, and it grounded morality in pleasing and useful consequences that result from our actions. All this has led to Hume being appropriated by modern atheists as one of us, as it were. But that was not how he saw himself. He may not have been a theist, but he certainly did not see himself as an atheist. Partly this was because he was as skeptical about atheism as he was about theism. Partly, it was because he saw reason as limited. That habit, experience, and custom were necessary for humans to understand the world and to live in it peacefully. And that faith and tradition were buttresses of the social order. Look for a people entirely devoid of religion, he wrote in his Natural History of Religion. If you find them at all, be assured that they are but a few degrees removed from brutes. In other words, he might have been skeptical about religion, but for him, religion was absolutely essential for the establishment of a moral, orderly society. And again, his refusal to see himself as an atheist was that atheism was more than about skepticism about God. It was a challenge to the social order, and Hume was no social radical, but a monarchist, a conservative. And it was not so much the unwillingness of the moderates, such as Locke or Hume, to break with tradition or theology that made it impossible for them to take a more radical stance in a way that some like Diderot or D'Holbach or Spinoza might have. It was more that their fear of revolutionary change made them embrace tradition and theology. Radicals, on the other hand, were not radical because they despised religion, or merely because they despised religion. It was also that they despised religion because they recognized faith and tradition as obstacles to the construction of a new social order. And reason, rather than faith, was for radicals the true foundation of a just society. Nicolas Antoine Boulanger, 17th century radical, he made the point, and this is true for virtually all the radical philosophers, that reason and law founded in reason should be the only sovereigns over mortals. For the radicals, philosophical reason was the only guide to human life. Philosophy, science, and morality had to be wrenched apart entirely from theology, and morality had to be grounded on secular criterion alone, particularly on the principle of equality. But the idea that reason should be sovereign over mortals was a deeply ambiguous concept. For some, it suggested that humans democratically, collectively, defined the rational social order. Reason, from this perspective, was a creative, democratic force. For others, however, it meant that humans had to submit themselves to reason. Reason here is more coercive than it is creative. It is not so much that human beings remake the world to their own conscious design. It is rather that it is remade for them through reason. And from this perspective, reason would appear to have replaced God in more ways than one. And both these views existed within the radical Enlightenment. There's an interesting parallel here, I think, between the way, this ambiguity over the notion of reason for the radical Enlightenment and the idea of history was to be for Marxists a century later. For some Marxists, of course, class conflicts and the iron laws of history propel humanity through its various stages to the inevitable and predestined triumph of communism. And real concrete humans play a very little role in this process, except as bearers of historical forces. Others recognize that history has no meaning but as the product of human activity. Marx wrote that humans make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. And in a sense, he tried to tie those two ideas together. Humans as history makers, humans as beings made by history. And how that idea was read, and not just by Marxists, depended on which side of the equation, humans making history or humans or circumstances not of their choosing, seemed more compelling. And this is true also about the idea of reason that the radical Enlightenment had. That whether one saw it as humans taking reason to remake the world, or humans submitting themselves to reason, to have the world remade for them by reason, depended on how one saw what it was to be human, how one saw the possibilities of change. At the heart of this debate, both the debate about reason and about history, is the difficulties in thinking about human agency from a materialist or naturalistic perspective, from the perspective of a world from which God has been expelled. See, the moral vision of the radicals may have been nourished by the crumbling of a God-ordained order, but it was also had to be rooted in faith, but faith of a different kind, faith that humans were capable of acting rationally and morally without guidance from beyond. The debate about reason was really a debate of the extent to which this was possible. Through the 19th century, in the post-Enlightenment world, religious faith crumbled in a way that even the radicals would scarcely have foreseen a century earlier. And yet, as faith in the divine crumbled, so did faith in the human capacity to act without God. The optimism that had once suffused the humanist impulse began to ebb away, and they began to develop a much darker view of what it meant to be human, a dark view that was framed broadly by two revolutions, the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848. For the radicals, the overthrow of the old regime in 1789 represented the practical embodiment of reason and of equality, and a concrete expression of social progress. For conservatives, it was an illustration of the darker side of reason and of the dangers of social progress, of what Isaiah Berlin called the precariousness of human institutions, the insufficiencies of simple formulas, the feebleness of reason before the power of fanatically believed values. And for many, the disorder and anarchy observed after 1789 led them to decry change and progress and to stress order, stability, tradition, authority, status, hierarchy. For opponents of the Enlightenment, the altar and the throne, rather than the parliament or the ballot box, had always been the twin pillars of a healthy society. And in the wake of the French Revolution, this belief found an echo within the ranks of Enlightenment believers too, so that the conviction that prejudice, that God was necessary, became much more important. That faith was necessary, became much more important again to a certain group of thinkers, the group of thinkers that gave rise to modern conservatism, to the counter-Enlightenment. If the French Revolution had catalysed a conservative reaction against the Enlightenment, the revolutions of 1848 had a similar impact on liberal opinion. The revolutions, which were a series of revolts and insurrections throughout Europe, largely in response to political tyranny and economic immiseration, were quickly crushed. But liberals who had often helped man the barricades in 1848 were shocked by the violence and the instability. And many turned their backs on the very idea of radical change. The English liberal Walter Bagehot, his response to the 1848 is an echo of someone like Edmund Burke to 1789. The first duty of society, he wrote, It's a preservation of society. To keep up the system, we must sacrifice everything: parliament, liberty, leading articles, essays, eloquence. All are good, but they are secondary. In other words, all that matters is the preservation of social order. And as a result of all this, the late 19th century experienced both a crisis of faith and a crisis of reason, what's been called a crisis of reason, the beginnings of a set of trends that became highly significant through this 20th century: the erosion of Enlightenment optimism, a disenchantment with ideas of progress, a disbelief in concepts of truth. It's interesting that both these developments, a disenchantment with faith and a disenchantment with reason, were expressed in the figure of Nietzsche. If Nietzsche was the high priest at God's funeral, he was also, if you like, the chief celebrant at reason's wake. And his brilliance at giving voice to the growing disaffection of his age with both reason and faith would eventually make him into the poster boy of the postmodern assault on the so-called Enlightenment project. And the history of the 20th century, of two world wars, of the Depression, of the Holocaust, Auschwitz and the Gulags, climate change and ethnic cleansing, helped further shatter that old sense of optimism and hope about human capacities. If the 19th century truly saw the death of God, one might describe the 20th century as being witness, if we were to use the same theological language, to the fall of man. In the Christian tradition, of course, the fall comes with Adam and Eve's disobedience of God. In the secular world, the fall comes with the sapping of optimism, a disenchantment with the possibilities of social transformation, the growth of a much darker view of human nature. We no longer believe, as the Canadian writer and politician Michael Ignatieff has observed, that material progress entails or enables moral progress. We eat well, we drink well, we live well, he has observed, but we do not have good dreams. And as a result, the very idea of human-directed transformation has been called into question. Many have come to feel that every impression that humanity makes upon the world is for the worst. The attempt to master nature has led to global warming and species depletion. The attempt to master society led to Auschwitz and the Gulags. Murray Bookchin, the late ecologist, he made the point that, in a real sense, we seem to be afraid of ourselves, of our uniquely human attributes. We seem to be suffering from a decline in human self-confidence, in our ability to create ethically meaningful lives that enrich humanity and the non-human world. And in response, people have done two things, in a sense. Some have turned back to God and looked for religion as that ethical concrete, as a way of establishing moral and social order in an age where neither seems to exist. And in particular, we've seen the rise of fundamentalism, the literal readings of the Holy Book, as ways of drawing hard lines when no such hard lines exist anymore. But interestingly, if some have turned to religion to provide an anchorage, a moral, a social anchorage in an age of uncertainties, others have turned to science. Science today is expected to provide not just a factual description of the world, but also a moral account of human existence as well. E.O. Wilson, the sociobiologist, he makes an interesting point, I think it's in his book, Consilience. He says, people need a sacred narrative. They need a sense of a larger purpose in one form or another, however intellectualized. And such a narrative can be either religion or science. The true evolutionary epic, retold as poetry, is as intrinsically ennobling as religious epic, he wrote. Evolutionary science has brought new revelations of great moral importance, from which new intimations of immortality can be drawn and a new mythos evolved. And for many, science has increasingly stepped in to answer questions that previously had been seen as political or moral. So many of the new atheists, for instance, someone like Sam Harris, the American philosopher, new atheist, he argues that science will decide which moral view is right, because discrepant moral answers translate into differences in our brains, and science can understand those differences and decide which moral answer is right and which is wrong. What is striking about these arguments is that they express a very religious, very Old Testament view of morality. Moral norms do not emerge through a process of social engagement or collective conversation, nor through a course of self-improvement, but rather are laws revealed on high from above and imposed upon those below. And this takes me back to the point about reason and the two notions of reason. Reason as something that humans use to create a better world, or reason as something to which humans submit to have a new world created for them. For this idea of science as the ethical concrete for our lives is a view of reason not as a creative democratic force, but as a coercive authoritarian power, and one to which humans must submit to their own betterment. So what we have, in a sense, is at the end of the process of death of God, we've got the resurrection of God in two different forms. One, as God himself, as religion comes back into play, and in the other, as reason or science, which takes a role of God and acts as God in our lives. And what's missing in both these senses is the notion of human beings as the creative, moral creators of our world. Which is why the point about the importance of the Enlightenment in establishing the other side of the death of God, in establishing the importance of faith in human capacities to transform the world, to make judgments, to make moral, social, political judgments, has become so important again. The irony is that the death of God did not happen in isolation. That what gave rise to the death of God also gave rise eventually to what I call the fall of man. Nietzsche wrote not just that God is dead, he also wrote that yet his shadow still remains. And he was right, though not necessarily in the way he originally meant. And it seems to me there's one thing that the Enlightenment should teach us. It is this. It is that disbelief in God matters little without belief in human beings. Thank you.